Hello and welcome to Jaeger's First Impressions on Sundered by Thunder Lotus Games. As you all know, Thunder Lotus Games does hand-drawn art and animation for their games, and also they've come out previously with a game called Jotun, a Norse mythology-based epic, also with all hand-drawn art and animations. So, needless to say, the art and animation in this game is absolutely beautiful. I will not talk at length about it because that would be way too easy. This game is the absolute epitome of beautiful, and I think that's all that needs to be said about it. Otherwise, you can see for yourself how amazing this game looks. So we'll be focusing on other portions. That being said, regardless of how beautiful it looks, there are a couple gripes that I've already developed, but we'll see if they can be improved through further gameplay. I'll leave that for our deep dive. So what I want to talk about is the plot and story of this game, which is still largely a mystery. This game, you play a character called Esh, a woman who you can see being trapped in this underground, constantly changing dungeon that you will play through in a Metroidvania-esque style. I'm not really sure what's going on in the story right now, but I can tell you that I very much would like to know what Thunder Lotus Games has attempted to do, and I'd like to say pretty successfully thus far after my roughly 10 hours of gameplay prior to making this first impressions review, is they are telling a narrative with as little speech as possible. And that goes not only for the actual plot of the game, but learning the game and playing through the game itself. Esh hasn't said a word thus far. And basically what occurs, without putting in any spoilers, is Esh gets sucked into this underground, constantly changing, procedurally generated, sort of, underground world filled with baddies and monsters, and she makes an alliance, I guess is the best way to say it, with what seems to be some kind of dark or vicious entity of some kind, which you'll see right about now, and gains these powers of combat. You start uncovering a little bit of story as you go through these small short voiceovers given to you by the actual Shard. But other than that, you don't know where these enemies came from, you don't know anything about this underground world, and you certainly don't know what the hell the bosses are or where they came from. So it's really just, hey, here's this world and have fun uncovering the plot, which is really interesting to me and is very easy to mess up. Thus far, I absolutely do not think Thunder Lotus Games messed it up. I think they've done a good job setting up the plot. This is a very interesting story that is being told with very minimal guidance. I want to know what's going on in the world, and I want to know what's happened previously, and it's driving me on forward through these rather difficult things that I never would have gone and willingly done in a game. So I think the plot is very interesting right now, and I can't wait to learn more about it. But as for now, I only know a little bit, and I'm not going to share it with you because that's a little bit spoilery. So that's my feelings on the plot right now. Is it has this massive air of mystery, and I desperately want to know what the heck is going on. And that is great. I think Thunder Lotus Games, you nailed it on the head. That's exactly what you were going for, is what it feels like, and that's exactly what you achieved, so well done there. Next, I want to talk about mechanics, specifically gameplay, and then we'll do progression second. Again, this is the first impressions, only about 10 hours in. I'm still learning nuances to it, but combat feels good. I love the impact of the weapons and different attacks. It seems appropriate for what you need to get done, and you slowly unlock different features that expand your ability to conduct said combat. So I think it's solid. I don't know if I'm missing something. I'm expecting it to develop a little more as the game goes on, but outside of the basic couple combos you can do by spamming your attack button, and then directionally associating those attacks, it kind of feels like the combat's a little repetitive to a degree from the sense of Esh's point of view or the player's point of view, because you can only do a specific set of moves in a row, and then you can manipulate that slightly by comboing in the air versus on the ground, and maybe changing direction once in the combo, sort of. And that pretty much applies specifically to aerial combat, changing direction, still working in the combo. So from Esh's point of view, the combat is a little repetitive. You're always going to be doing the same motions over and over. That being said, those motions look very nice, they sound very nice, they function perfectly and mechanically and get the job done. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the combat is, at its core, simplistic. And there's not even a separate interact button. Basically, if you want to do something in the game, you're either going to be jumping or attacking. Those are the functions that you have available to you. So mechanically, the game is very simple, but how you use those mechanics is where the degree of difficulty and the player's skill comes into play. Frankly, I think that is really cool, but it can also be a little annoying as the player because it feels like, well, I only have this very small set of tools. How do I use that to overcome this massive challenge? Because the game is absolutely challenging. And, well, I think the answer to that is, practice makes perfect. Experience is going to improve that. Also, you need to find out the nuances of how it works. It's one of those things where it's easy to learn, difficult to master. And those kind of mechanics and rule sets and techniques can really drive a intrinsically motivated player to succeed and get really good at something, and the feeling of getting something done when that's the motivation behind it, based off of strictly the tool set given to you, the feeling of achievement is awesome, especially for those intrinsically motivated players. My concern is you'll have people who want to see a more apparent change in their combat ability that this game doesn't provide. At least not yet. Again, only 10 hours in, and I firmly believe that this is not going to be the case through the whole game. In fact, I know that there are other combat mechanics that I haven't accessed yet. Reading through Thunder Lotus Games information they've provided, as well as seeing a couple other, snippets of gameplay from their website and their previews and things like that. I know there's things like heavy attacks that I haven't gotten access to, and various other things, and I'm hoping eventually an aerial dodge, but I'm not going to hold out too much hope for that. But the point I'm making is, at the start of the game it's simplistic, and I'm fairly certain it's going to grow more complex, which is going to enable players to do more things, especially particularly in combat. But right now, in the first couple hours, or in the first 10 hours rather, of gameplay, it's kind of simplistic, but it gets the job done. And part of that is in part to the enemy design. The enemy design is actually fairly simplistic as well. You have little guys that turn on electricity and run at you. You have little meteors that try to crash into you. You have robots that shoot lasers at you. And then there's a couple other things that I'm getting into, such as giant robots with blades that are much more complex in their attack patterns and targeting abilities and things like that. So not only does the game start out trying to murder you and being pretty effective at it, but it continues to get better and better at challenging you as a player. So the game's difficulty is on point if you like reasonably difficult games. It also is difficult without being punishing, which I think is really valuable. That's a selling point for some games like Dark Souls, but this certainly doesn't jump to that extent and degree. You don't lose all your little experience or money shards when you die. You do indeed get to keep them, and in fact it adds a roguelite element. So I think that's very cool, and also I think the introduction of it was very clever too. There is no hint whatsoever that that is the progression system jumping into the game until the first time you die. And frankly, it felt like the game wanted me to get that first death. It just felt like they were throwing so much at me. And the combat is reasonably difficult because you only get a very small amount of iframes on your roll. The safest place feels like the air, and staying in the air can be a challenge sometimes. And there's just so much information being thrown at you on the screen during combat that it's a true challenge. But that kind of leads us into progression. So we're going to talk about the progression system. You have the, I think it's a safe venture to say standard Metroidvania progression system of unlocking different skills and abilities as you go through the game and explore the different regions and beat the different bosses. Is, you know, you can't enter this room without this certain ability, and in order to get this certain ability, you have to go to the other side of the map. That is basically the definition of a Metroidvania game, and they established that very well. I think it works perfectly, but it is also a tried and true mechanic of this type of game. I'm very happy to see that Thunder Lotus Games successfully implemented it, and I don't think that's going to change throughout the gameplay. I think that it works and they did it properly, so no complaints there. Well done, well designed. I just hope that the actual abilities you do unlock maintain their usefulness throughout the entire game. And thus far, that's the feeling I've gotten. And then the other degree of progression that you have that I've discovered is you have this perk system. When you die, you can spend your experience points and get perks, kind of like increasing stats in other games, yada yada yada. But one thing I'd like to note about that degree of progression system is basically it's a series of incremental stat boosts. And not only that, but in this particular game, it is heavily focused on simply increasing your survivability. There are a couple things that will increase your damage and combat capabilities within these trees, but talking specifically outside of the active abilities provided to you, which are focused on mostly platforming, but to some degree combat as well, these passive bonuses are all, you know, incremental +5 max shield, -1 second on your shield recharge time, things like that. Which, initially, my thoughts are, well, I understand the purpose of this, and I don't mind it as a player, but this game, I was hoping to see more. I wanted to see, you know, crazy different features, like maybe a retaliation option where when my shield depletes, I release an electric charge that damages nearby enemies, or, you know, something a little more interesting, a little more feedbacky, and a little bit more combat focused. So I didn't actually expect myself to feel power spikes every time I died, but as long as I had enough to get maybe 2 or 3 upgrades, I actually did feel a significant power spike. I was genuinely surprised at the effectiveness of these incremental passive boosts. And that's great. That means that the numbers behind the game should be reasonably balanced. That's what that tells me. So that is an impressive feat for Thunder Lotus Games to have achieved. Granted, keeping the passive incremental boosts of just upping the stats of a character means that, you know, there's a little less interesting evolution of the character that's visible to the player, other than feeling more powerful, which it certainly does. But you don't look more powerful. You don't do things that seem more powerful outside of the active skills that you unlock through standard Metroidvania progression. So I think that's one little drawback that I've felt thus far. I don't think it's a major issue, especially because they've got that feeling of being more powerful even with the passive boosts. Like, I was stuck on a point, I ended up dying, spent some of my experience, went back, and then I crushed the thing that killed me. So the power spike is real. It makes the player feel good. It's like, man, I died, but I don't mind because I progressed because I died, essentially. Which is really cool. We've seen it in other games before, but Thunder Lotus Games did a great job making us feel that way. And that can be a challenge in some games, but they nailed it on the head. Moving on to the other level of progression that I haven't yet been able to take a part of because I'm going slow and methodical through this game is there's these things called Elder Shards that I guess are related to like these Eldritch Horrors. I don't want to throw in any kind of spoilers here, not that I have too many after all, it's only 10 hours in, but I guess they're supposed to be able to empower your current abilities. I don't know to what degree that's going to happen. And also, I guess there's a trade-off, because there are multiple endings to the game, which speaks to its replayability. Somehow there's some kind of balance between trading your soul for power versus keeping your humanity and doing something else, I guess, with the shards. We'll have to see. But that'll be interesting to see how that impacts the feel of progression as well as the power scaling of the character. The next thing, mechanically, is platforming. which is very important in Metroidvania games. And at first, I felt the controls were very floaty. It has the function of the longer you hold down A, the higher you jump to a specific extent. The character kind of feels very light. You can get a lot of airtime. You kind of drag a little bit when you try to stop your character unless you whip the other direction. The wall jumping feels good, but also you need to kind of force it by moving the control stick back and forth instead of having a set distance you wall jump. It all helps in the player's mobility, and initially I wasn't a big fan of it. I don't like the flighty feel of moving in games, but it works. The longer you play this, the more comfortable you get and the more you understand the movement of Esh as the player. And being that flighty and having the ability to stay in the air that long is very important to Esh's survivability as the player. And I think they did a good job and found a nice balance. It just takes a little while to get used to. And this game doesn't give you a lot of time to get used to it. It very much tries to kill you out the gate. But dying is part of the game mechanics, so it's not necessarily that big of a problem. I absolutely love the aerial combat in this game. I think it's awesome, and I also love that the combat mechanics also aid in the platforming. As you start playing, you'll notice that you travel a little bit further laterally when you do a side attack in the air, or you travel a little bit further vertically when you do an up attack in the air. Things like that. So not only are they functional in combat, but they're functional for platforming, which means that they're meshing these important integral mechanics of a Metroidvania game together. That was very evident very quickly in the game. So that was well done, but that isn't really taught to you outside of a couple tips and loading screens. So it's very much, here's the world, learn how to do what you need to do. And I don't think that's a problem. I think that's really cool. But some people prefer a little bit more structure, and it should be noted so that people are aware that's what's happening in the game. It's very much up to the player to figure these things out. But finally, to wrap up my first impressions, I think overall this game is great. I'm loving it so far. It is extremely difficult for someone of my caliber of gamer. I think I'm a pretty average gamer. I spend a lot of time on games, but I don't spend time, nailing the perfect mechanics. And that being said, I think someone who spends enough time to really get to know the mechanics of this game's platforming and combat could be able to do some truly amazing things with the system. Things like people who speedrun and stuff like that, just awesome. I also want to note some of the issues that I've already noticed but have been addressed and Thunder Lotus Games is aware of, because that's very important, and this is on PC specifically. There are some other issues on PS4 if that's what you're looking at this for, so I would recommend going and checking out their website to see the known issues. But for PC specifically, one thing I noticed that they are already aware of is load times are kind of long. You can end up sitting at a screen for a little while, but the game also loads a fairly large chunk of the game and procedurally generates sections of it. So it makes sense that the load times are a little long, and also I've found that with more deaths and repeated entrances to the same general areas, the load times tend to shorten a little bit. So initially it was a little bit of a concern, but honestly, taking a breather after being assaulted by a ridiculous amount of monsters is kind of welcomed. So they are aware of it though, and they're trying to optimize loading times across all platforms. Also, on some PCs and laptops without dedicated graphics card, the game can have frame drops or crashes, so be aware of that if you don't have a dedicated graphics card in your system. I haven't had either of those issues with my graphics card, luckily, so that isn't something that I noticed, but Lotus Games is aware of it, and they want to do something about it, which is great for the community. And then also, again, tutorial-ish system of text popping up. Some of the on-screen text suggests incorrect buttons to play. That's a problem. I haven't noticed it yet, but if I did notice it, I'd be very upset about it. So it is a very relieving element to know that Thunder Lotus Games is already aware of and planning to fix this. That being said, overall, within the first 10 hours of the game, I love it. I think it is beautiful. I think it sounds beautiful. I think the mechanics are great, but take a little while to learn, and I think the game's difficulty is very aggressive, which will likely turn some more casual players off of the game. So hopefully I can feel power spikes enough to know that it's not going to take a extended amount of dedicated time to actually get to the end and learn the story of what's going on. But yeah, I think the game's good so far. And I can't wait to do the deep dive on this and get into the nitty-gritty of some of the more fine details after knowing a little bit more about the game. So come back Wednesday for Jaeger's deep dive on Sundered from Thunder Lotus Games. Otherwise, thanks for watching our first impressions, and I'll see you online soon.